Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Appliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Well, Matt, I feel like I'm reliving 2017 as we are going to visit today about the University of Michigan football team cheating scandal. And I, of course, reference 2017 because that was the year the Astros employed plastic trash cans to hit bats to communicate the pitches that were coming in from the electronic sign stealing program they had. Once again, we have one of Tom's teams wins a national championship while cheating. Now, I don't want to suggest there's any causation nor even correlation, but I'm worried.
Tom, I guess my big question is, what was the name of your fifth grade Little League team? Should we be prepared for some scandal coming out from your hometown or something like that? Because this is a pattern and practice with you and your sports teams.
Well, as someone said, I've never seen Jim Harbaugh and Tom Fox in the same room. So who knows? Anyway, do you want to start this one or do you want me to start this one?
Since you are the Michigan alum, and I admit that I was not keeping a close eye on this until I saw your flurry of blog posts analyzing this issue, and the flurry of posts was excellent, but you're closer to this, so I'll let you take the lead and set the scene for everybody who maybe like me had not had this on their radar. I am from New England. College football is not that big of a deal here. So therefore, I have some thoughts about what it means and some parallels for regulatory enforcement and corporate compliance, but I'll let you take it out first.
Sure. So it started with something called impermissible scouting. And the NCAA says you can't send coaches to do in-person off-campus scouting. In other words, if I'm the University of Michigan, I can't send a University of Michigan coach, intern, or agent to another football game of a visiting or a opponent of Michigan. Now, you can scout the old-fashioned way with tapes. There's all of these fabulous video shots you can scout from. All that's fine, but you can't do what's called this impermissible scouting, and that's in person. And with many FCPA investigations that we're more comfortable or at least more familiar with, once you start kind of nosing around, or as Warren Buffett would say, as the tide goes out, there's all sorts of fish flopping around that may not smell too good. So we had recruiting violations, recruiting inducements. We had improper communications because the NCAA regulates communications between schools and potential student athletes. Then we had Michigan as recidivist. This was back-to-back major infractions within 2 years. And then two others that I need to highlight: leadership failures. The Michigan football coach at the time was Jim Harbaugh. He's now left, and he coaches at the San Diego Chargers in the NFL, the National Football League, pro football. But his leadership failure was both in allowing this to happen and or knowing about it, his complete antithesis and marginalizing of the University of Michigan's compliance function at the university, and then his failure to, well, I shouldn't say failure to cooperate, his obstruction of the investigation. And as everyone knows, the cover-up's always worse than the scandal, and that's what we had here, coupled with a head coach refusing to cooperate with an investigation. So some very bad facts, some very egregious conduct within the context of NCAA football regulations. And I recognize that some people don't think that college football is not number two, but number one in all of the world's discussions. But that aside, those are the rules and regs. We have a organization called the National Association of Collegiate Athletics, and NCAA, and they are charged with enforcing their own regulations. And they are as toothless an enforcer as one could have. Now, part of that is because college football has become so powerful that the conferences have realigned themselves together and basically said the NCAA has the basketball tournament and that's it. And part of it is that with NIL and the dollars that are dumped into college sports, They have no real control over anything. But it shows what happens when you completely defang a regulator that they can't deliver a penalty consummate to the conduct.
I have to say, there's a ton of stuff we could talk about here, and maybe in the fullness of time we can. But the thing that jumped out to me most was the lamentable state of college, not just college sports, but college football in particular. Like, clearly, Michigan comes across now as this is a football team with a loss leading subsidiary of a higher education institution. And I was even struck. I was reading your post, Tom, about how the leader of the organization was paying not paying any attention to compliance. But the whole implicit point was the leader was Harbaugh, the organization was the football team. Could we back up and remember the organization is supposed to be the University of Michigan, and the leader is supposed to be the president and presumably the Board of Regents? And somehow we have lost sight of this. One thing that came back to me time and time again is we are talking about a superstar employee, Harbaugh, superstar business unit that is eclipsing all other parts of the organization, the football team casting this huge shadow over the rest of the enterprise. And it is not supposed to be that way. I am reminded a lot of, in the corporate world, how many times, Tom, have we talked about these larger than life figures like Elon Musk, Steve Wynn, Donald Trump, frankly, these imperial overlords who there's no oversight structure to bring them back and keep them confined within certain rules of good conduct. And then they're just not. And then everything else goes astray. That lesson about the importance of keeping superstar employees on the right path so they will set the right tone. And look, maybe they're a superstar salesman and they're not setting the tone so much as obeying the rules. Maybe they're a superstar executive like Harbaugh was. Their job is to set the tone and enforce it. And he didn't, because it was his team that was doing all sorts of stuff. That was one big thing that struck me. And then the other thing that I would wholly agree with is the NCAA and its toothlessness on enforcement. When we look at these penalties, really, the penalties were a joke. I would say that Harbaugh, who, let's remember, he's almost 62. Technically, he's been banned from the NCAA, I think, for another 14 years. But the guy's an NFL coach. He never has to go back to the NCAA. And there are three ways to hold an individual accountable. You can put him in prison, which the NCAA can't do. You could fine them money. They didn't do that to him. Or you could crimp his career, and they didn't do that to him either, because this idea that you can't now go back to a job that you're probably never going to return to anyways, because he's going to coach in the NFL for a while and then pop up as an analyst somewhere and sail off into retirement. What are we doing? He suffered no substantive consequences, I would say. And ditto for Michigan, where you could talk about the penalties more than me, but I would think if you really wanted to sting Michigan to change its behavior, you would dock it some of the scholarship and recruitment opportunities it can deliver in the future, basically to make it a weaker team for 5 or 10 years and teach them the hard way that this is what happens. You're not punishing current athletes because these people haven't shown up to play yet, but you are curbing Michigan's ability to grow, kind of like the way that the Federal Reserve put an asset cap on Wells Fargo for 9 years. So there are ways that you could really change an organization, and there are ways you could hold an individual accountable, none of which happened here. And I will stop there for now.
Let's go back to your initial point about superstar salesmen. It's even more of an anomaly than that, Matt, because in probably half the states of the United States, the head football coach of the public university is the highest paid state employee. That's certainly true in the South, where football is not football, it's the religion of football. I haven't been able to determine if that was true in Michigan, but nevertheless, it is completely skewed. And when you have these asymmetrical coach being paid more than any other state employee, including the head of state, the governor, by a factor of 100, you can see why they think they're above everything. And that is one of the factors of the amount of money that can be generated by a football program, particularly a winning football program. So that's a huge problem there. And then on the penalty side, the NCAA does have penalties available. They can actually either forfeit games that Michigan won during this time,
Yep.
or they can vacate wins. The difference is a forfeit gives the win to the opposing team. Vacating the win does not give the win to the other team, and that would cause Michigan to lose its national championship. If we go maybe a step further, in the Astros sign stealing scandal, we had the anomaly of the Astros stealing signs at home, communicating that by banging trash cans, except they had a higher average on the road. So what on earth were they doing it for? And then when they got to the World Series, they didn't do it, and they won. So how much did the Astros actually gain? And the same with Michigan. With this impermissible scouting, we have to assume, although the NCAA was never able to connect the dots and say the information gathered by Connor Stallion and his team to give scouting reports and stealing of signs of the opposing team. So there's no direct connection in the NCAA report. If we assume some of that information filtered to Michigan, how much did it matter? Did it matter at all? And I once had a former Wells Fargo employee tell me that whole sign stealing scandal was for a couple of million in profit, Tom. So it's just completely out of whack.
Yeah.
And we have the highest paid employee in the state. We have a lack of oversight of that employee, then an enforcement agency that will not put the hammer down, even to the point where you said you could take away the scholarships going forward and make them pay for it for 4 or 5 years. You don't have to give them the death penalty. That's been given once in the 80s against SMU, and they have never recovered from that. So perhaps you don't want to do that to the most prestigious university in the Big Ten, but it's a real conundrum.
I kind of focused on where the NCAA was saying they didn't want to impose harsh penalties on student athletes who are there now who had nothing to do with the cheating. That kind of sort of reminds me of people who say we shouldn't impose penalties on corporations because really that just harms shareholders today who didn't have anything to do with the misconduct before. Okay, well, A, we don't know that because we don't know who the shareholders today were and were they still shareholders back then. B, they are still benefiting from the previous misconduct because of a higher share price often. But I do also remember sticking with the corporate penalties angle for a moment. So Carolyn Crenshaw, who is a Democratic commissioner on the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the only Democrat right now because they're only at 4 instead of 5 commissioners. And so she's still there holding the candle for the minority party. But several years ago, she gave a speech on corporate penalties at the start of the Biden administration, where she basically said, could we all just remember that penalties are meant to punish and you are supposed to do it and teach people a lesson. And by punishing one person, you also remind everybody else we shouldn't do this. And there was always, I thought, a lot of sense in that. So what are you doing, NCAA? There was some pretty egregious misconduct here. Harbaugh is certainly not in a flattering light, but you're right that Connor Stallions is underling and various other underlings underneath who were saying some really nasty, unpleasant stuff about corporate compliance and destroying evidence and investigations. If you had done that in a corporation, the chief compliance officer would try to strangle that person or throw them off the roof, or the Justice Department would land on that employee with both feet, or impose severe penalties on a corporation. And really, none of that happened here with the NCAA. So that's the thing that gets me most agitated in this whole case, is that the university was clearly turning a blind eye to the football team. Jim Harbaugh was turning a blind eye to what everybody else was doing under his tutelage. I was struck by how the few people who did try to talk and raise concerns to managers in the football program, the managers were turning Tom, you would describe it as willful blindness. I'm going to call it willful deafness because they were expressly saying, I don't want to hear this. So what does that say about a speak up culture or a listen up culture where the managers receiving the reports are basically blocking their ears? It's just so much of this stunk to high heaven. It is a really disappointing outcome. And what else are other schools supposed to take away from this? Because Michigan did bad stuff and it had the wherewithal and the resources to curb it and probably curb it and still be a really good team anyways. They have more money than God or Paul McCartney put together. And still they decided to engage in this and we're going to let them off? What? It's just disappointing all around.
So I was able to tease some tangible, I think, lessons for compliance. I wanted to pitch these to you, Matt, and see
Yep.
one, if you would agree with them, and two, maybe you saw some others. But number one is you have to tie down the documents. So Connor Stallion made a big deal of his throwing his iPhone in a pond. But when your iPhone goes in water and you don't know where that water is, it's a problem. And so tie your documents down. Two, Connor Stallion attended some of these games for the impermissible scouting, but he had a team that he compensated to do that. That means they're your agents. And so, but he had a team of uncompensated assistants, and they were called interns.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, one of those interns raised the question that you just said. He went to his manager and said, I'm a little concerned that this is illegal. And I can't hear you, Jeffrey. Came right out. And so when you have someone doing your work for you, they are your agent. And it doesn't matter whether they are paid or not paid in this case. And when it comes to the not paid, I thought there was a great point about they zeroed in on a compliance failure, which was to train the interns. The interns did not receive any substantive compliance training. And here I'd harken back to the original HP FCPA case, where a contract employee said that he thought something was wrong with a contract, where an agent, a one-person agent, was receiving a $10 million fee for a $44 million contract when he had no experience, he had no office, and he was one person with no contract except for a bill. And he said he didn't know how to raise it internally. So all of that means if it's a temporary employee, you got to train them. If it's a volunteer employee in the form of an intern, you got to train them. It's not unusual for a business to have an intern in the summer and not compensate them. So I thought that was a good lesson as well. You have to cooperate. I shouldn't say that. If you want cooperation credit, you have to cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
And that came to me loud and clear. And then the culture that Harbaugh set, and you're right to cite some examples, which we will not say because it's a PG podcast, but suffice to say they would have taken us to an R rating if we said what I wrote in these blog posts about what Michigan football staff said about compliance. And that really spoke to the relationship of the football team to the compliance officer. Did you see really any substantive lessons beyond those?
Well, I actually did think that the intern point was a great one, that a lot of companies do have these peripheral quasi-employees. Maybe they're interns, maybe they're contract employees, maybe they're individual contractors who are working on some sort of contingent basis for you. Maybe they're business partners if you have a staffing service that provides people for, I don't know, managing your payroll or some sort of special project. But this rolling pool of talent that comes and goes, and who are they and what are they doing? They're often doing the scut work, and that's often where the stuff nobody wants to see or come to light, that's where it happens, is with these people. So I thought that was really interesting. And frankly, let's remember who interns are. They're typically 18 to 22 years old. They might have some moral sense that this seems wrong, but they will often quite naturally think, well, I guess since I'm just the intern, I don't know exactly what's going on. Maybe this is how it's going. It seems weird to me, but I guess I'm the weird one and this doesn't stink. No, that it stinks. Actually, I can remember I once interviewed the Theranos whistleblower, Tyler Schultz, and he was 23 at the time when he worked at Theranos. And so I asked him, at first, did you think you were the crazy one, that this had to be real and it wasn't as bad as it looked? And he said, basically, yeah, it took me a while to realize that. And so there's a lot of valuable intel that can be obtained by these peripheral quasi-employees, whatever we want to call them, who may have a sense that something is amiss, but might not be sure. And you could cultivate them and bring them on your side. Of course, that's not what happened here at Michigan. At Michigan, they basically tried to mow down every sort of independent moral impulse or perception these people had. And then, Tom, your point about how Stalions and I don't know if it was just him or others, but Stalions basically ripped up and shredded his devices and chucked them into the bottom of a pond somewhere. The ideal for a corporate compliance team would be to say, well, who cares? Because we capture all of this information as documentation and storage. So knock yourself out. We are not going to send the frogman to go dig up the device. It's already been stored in the cloud, and now we can retrieve it. Certainly, if you were a regulated financial firm, that would have to be the case. You're supposed to retain all business documents, and it can't be retained on somebody's phone that he might chuck out the window or drop in a toilet or who knows what. So I think that is another one there. And I guess maybe the only other thing that sticks with me from this whole debacle, the sad part is that the chief compliance officer at Michigan, she was trying to do her level best here, and Harbaugh just was not interested in pulling her in. And every single time she had to try and make some effort, and she did try, it was like pulling teeth with these people. And that is absolutely not the way it should be. Every compliance officer listening already knows that. Suffice to say, probably not an unfamiliar situation for a lot of compliance officers that you are desperate for the operational teams to actually want to be compliant, and they're just not, and they're ignoring you, and what are you supposed to do there? And it's a really hard nut to crack, and it seems like that was the case here too.
A couple of other things, Matt. One is the current head coach was the former head assistant head coach, and he deleted over 100 texts from his phone, and he's the current head coach.
Crazy.
Crazy, number one. And number two is there were an additional set of violations that I mentioned at the start of the pod, communications with recruits, and then buying of gifts, which were meals. All of these were, the meals were not outlandish. They were relatively small, certainly a few $100s at most, but those were specific NCAA violations. And they've been in place forever, back when a meal meant something, because players weren't receiving millions of dollars of NIL money. But if you have small rules in place, you got to follow those policies and procedures as well. And it was just further evidence of the culture at Michigan that they didn't think they had to follow any.
No, it's a sad statement. It's the broken windows theory applied to college football and collegiate atmosphere. And it is just, there's really nothing redeeming about any of this. I don't know a single person, maybe other than the Michigan chief compliance officer who tried her darndest and still was stonewalled. Other than her, I don't think anybody comes out of this looking good. Not Harbaugh, not the team, not the current coach, not Harbaugh's assistants at the time. Maybe the interns, I guess the ones who tried to speak up, okay, they look kind of good. Not the NCAA, not the university administration. What a god-awful mess.
I think that's about the perfect way to end this podcast.
All right.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review. where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.